of being the last speaker in an event that is currently a half hour running late by a half hour. I will give you a few insights here about how I think about the world. I'm a very visual person. I tend to think about things and make sense of the world through metaphors and through the use of visual imagery. And so I'm going to incorporate some of that into my final presentation today. Start off with a brief introduction. And there's a very famous poem by the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges. And he talks about a man who tries to write a book in which he summarizes everything that's known about the universe. And so he finishes it, he comes outside, he's thanking the heavens for being done with this really huge project that he's just completed, and he looks up at the sky and he realizes he forgot to include the moon. What I am not going to try to do in the next few minutes is summarize all of the amazing discussion that has happened over the past day and a half. Rather, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to select a few key themes that seem to me to come up over and over again and resonate across different people. I will be mentioning comments that several of you made. Apologies to those of you who I don't mention. Your insights were great. I just couldn't incorporate all of them into this summary. Okay. First, I have 6 themes that I'm going to talk about. The first one is this problem of getting clear, firm recommendations from scholars. One of the complaints that I hear over and over again about people who do what I do for a living is getting us to commit, getting us to give a real answer, one that's practical and useful and so forth, because what I keep hearing is that scholars hedge. Scholars are sort of constantly clearing their throat, and they have all of these various very detailed and they make a lot of, well, under these conditions, if this were to happen, I could possibly recommend this, but only if there were more research, okay? What it reminds me of when I think about this is if you ever you're making an omelet, okay, and you break some eggs into a bowl, and you're going to reach into the bowl and you're going to try to take out the little shell that fell in, but every time you go to grab a hold of it, it runs away from you, right? Yep. This is what it's like typically trying to pin down a scholar. But Thomas Abt yesterday came out and said, we should do focused deterrence. The evidence is very strong, it's very clear. If we don't know what to do, start there. Similar level of strength. He said we should be doing cognitive behavioral therapy. There was no hedging. We should be doing this. The evidence is very strong. If you're not doing it, you have a violence problem, do it. I was fascinated. I don't know Alex Piquero very well, one of the most prominent criminologists in the field. And somebody asked, well, what are the 3 things, I think it was Chuck who asked, what are the 3 things that we ought to be doing? He didn't hedge one bit in saying nurse-family partnerships in prenatal and early childhood. The evidence is overwhelming. Family and parenting interventions for kids in that early childhood, 3 to 6-year-old range, cognitive behavioral therapy, late childhood, early adolescence with a goal of developing better social control abilities, okay? So I just want to point out, I thought it was astounding that you have 2 scholars, 2 leaders in the field who didn't hedge one bit. They came right out and said, the evidence is strong and we ought to do those things. As a scholar who's heard this critique many times, I was really stunned at how firm both of them were in making those recommendations, and I think the research evidence supports their recommendations. Theme 2, importing initiatives from other nations. Control C, Control V. We're going to copy an intervention and we are going to paste it in another location. As somebody who has done a lot of work in the developing world, I see this over and over again. We heard Robin Braverman talk about copying a US program. I love this word. Where is Robin? She's not even here. But she said copying a US program doesn't make it Honduranized. I like that word. I have a new word that I can use now. Enrique talked about the transfer and adaptation of US models in Central America. I was really fascinated in my recent tour of several cities in Honduras. I keep hearing over and over again, they talk about in their efforts to develop community policing initiatives, they studied the Japanese, they studied the Brazilians, they studied the Nicaraguans. But ultimately what their goal was to develop what they called a modelo catracho, a local term used to refer to basically a Honduran homegrown method of implementing community policing, where maybe they take little pieces from other countries, but they're not doing that copying and pasting, and that is so absolutely important. And so one of the issues is making sure that we match a program to its context, okay? The other piece is, and Guillermo talked about this a lot, is importing essential program elements. Here's a quote. There's a literature in political science and in policy studies, and the term is known as policy transfer. That's what political scientists, that's the term they use to refer to taking a program from one place and putting it in another place. And there's this fascinating quote from one of the policy transfer studies. It says, policies cannot easily be packaged, put in a container, transported to a new location, and then simply become embedded and established in the new setting. This is the best part. Rhetoric, labels, and nomenclature travel much more easily than the nuts and bolts of policy. That quote does not come from criminology. That's just a general quote from this policy transfer literature, and it is absolutely applicable to what we do when we take programs in one place, and particularly when we try to implement them in the developing world. And I thought Guillermo made a great point when he talked about we must export the active ingredients of the medicine, not just the label. His comment fits perfectly into that academic literature on policy transfer. Issue 3, what Thomas Abt referred to as the evaluation imperative, building a knowledge base on violence and its prevention. This is a slightly misleading picture of how I think about this. I like to think about our knowledge base on criminology and on violence and how to prevent violence as being a puzzle where most of the pieces are missing. I couldn't find a puzzle where most of the pieces are missing, so this is an overly optimistic summary of how I think about this. But imagine you're building a puzzle and you don't know what the puzzle is about. You don't know what the puzzle is ultimately going to look like, and you're missing most of the pieces. So imagine you have 3% of the pieces, and you start to have 3% or 4% of the pieces put together, and you're trying to guess, what is it, a flower? Is it a clown? What is it? You can't guess because you don't have enough of the pieces. This is how I think about criminological research evidence generally, in terms of its, how do we solve the violence problem? But in particular, in the developing world, we don't know the answers. And so Thomas talked about cumulative knowledge building is critical. We have major gaps in our knowledge about violence and its prevention because so much of what's out there hasn't been evaluated at all, or if it has been evaluated, it hasn't been evaluated well. And these gaps are really prominent in the developing world especially. Virtually all of the research evidence that Thomas talked about yesterday in the meta review, this is not his fault because it's just based on what's out there, is based on research primarily from the United States, several other developed nations, and really just very, very little high quality research from the developing world using experimental and quasi-experimental designs. And because of that, we just don't know what to do. 4th out of 6 points, building a practical analytical capacity using high quality research that matters. If you do a search on Google for the term professor and you choose animated as the option, this is the kind of stuff you come up with. This is how the world sees professors. Professors live in this ivory tower. Apparently we look like that. We have white mustaches, who knew? There's this mentality that professors are sort of disconnected from the real world. I need to get some kind of stick. Apparently professors have sticks. I don't know what we do with the stick, but What's
gender too?
Oh, and there's an absolute gender issue. In fact, yes, and a race issue. Absolutely, there's no question about it. And so the way the world thinks about professors and our applicability to real-world problems, to practical problems, and how to solve those problems is very biased. The thought processes that we live in this ivory tower, and we don't know what's going out there in the real world. And so, given what we do, given our field, we need to develop academic programs where our researchers are out there mixing it up in the real world, doing important research that matters, whether it's talking to offenders and talking to justice operators and so forth. We have a general lack of capacity in the region to do high quality research that influence policy and practice. Yesterday, Sheridan Hill raised this issue, and what I talked about was in Trinidad at the time, a few years back, criminologists define themselves as people who basically are throwing stones at the government. They are just the people who the newspaper calls to pick on government officials and say that they're doing everything wrong, okay? And there's a use for that. Anthony Harriet is doing very important work in Jamaica that's throwing stones at the police service, but it's work that needs to be done. I'm not saying that it can't be done, but what I am saying is it shouldn't be the only way of defining criminology and what we do. We need to be much broader than that. We need to have a deep analytical capacity, but it can't just be a deep analytical capacity with us sitting there on our computers in the ivory tower. We need to be out there in these communities, seeing how the justice system operates in its reality, seeing how people live in these very challenging environments in which many of the people in the world live. Robert Braverman mentioned this issue when she talked about training local universities and strengthening their research capacity. Guillermo again talked about building local capacity to do research and strengthen practice at the same time. So simultaneously achieving both that analytical capacity and that practical utility in the region. One of the things I want to mention is we don't just need to build that capacity within universities. And I'll give a couple of examples. We need to build it in universities, but we also need to build it in agencies. And so when I think about the region, I think about a couple of examples. Claudia talked this morning about this amazingly practical research that he and his colleagues have been doing in Brazil. His center is a model for the kind of thing that we need to develop throughout the region, where we have this criminological, this analytical capacity to do research that matters. But also within justice agencies. I'm highly biased in the point I'm about to make. About, 12, 14 years ago, my colleagues and I developed essentially the crime and problem analysis branch in the Trinidad and Tobago Police Service. And like I say, I'm biased because I was part of creating it. I actually named it. But really, I think serves as a model for the region. I'm not involved with it anymore. I'm actually a consumer of it. They are consistently sending me data. I'm very happy that they're set up to do that. But really, I think one of the best models in the region for how to do, it's not research in the way we think about research. It's not university level research. It's not theoretical research. But it's very highly practically applicable research within the agency to help them, for instance, do hotspots policing and identify gang territories and these kinds of practical issues. So we need the analytical capacity at the university level, we need the analytical capacity in the agencies, and ideally this beautiful partnership between the two. And that's what Trinidad is starting to experience now, and it's a great model. Fifth point, institutional strengthening. We heard this come up over and over again. Thomas Abt talked about how evidence-based criminology privileges certain types of methods. And so we have these quasi-experimental, experimental designs to test narrowly defined programs and policies, but we ignore those deep institutional issues that really deserve our attention. And these larger institutional issues came up over and over again over the past day and a half. Anthony talked about them in Jamaica, Antonio and Ana Karina talked about them in Honduras, Claudia just talked about them in Brazil. These are issues that deserve our attention. And just because we can't randomize them or do quasi-experimental or experimental designs on them, doesn't mean that researchers don't have a role here. One of the terms that Chuck and I have been using now for probably 15 years when we go into a new environment, we use the term diagnosis. So imagine going into your doctor and telling the doctor that you're not feeling well, and the doctor hands you a bottle of pills without actually examining you and seeing what's wrong. But that's actually what happens a lot in the developing world. Somebody asked a question earlier about INL. I'm going to pick on INL just a little bit here because INL doesn't necessarily have that diagnostic capacity. They tend not to work with researchers a lot. They're coming in and putting in place American-based solutions in developing countries. Sometimes those might be the right solutions, and sometimes they might not be the right solutions. And so what we need to pair with, I think, INL's efforts is we need diagnoses, and this is where researchers can really play a big role. We need high-quality diagnoses, and they're not going to be randomized trials and quasi-experiments. They might be very basic kinds of research, spending time doing field research with officers on the street, or shadowing prosecutors, or studying courtroom practices, talking to offenders, visiting high-crime communities. All of these kinds of research are hugely valuable for thinking about these bigger institutional issues. And finally, my closing point is, and Thomas raised this one, and we heard it from others as well, is violence as a development issue. I don't know if anybody, can I see a show of hands if you've read this book? Thomas, I don't. Okay. My suggestion to everybody in this room, buy this book. This book is by Gary Haugen at the International Justice Mission. It's called The Locust Effect: Why the End of Poverty Requires the End of Violence. When I read this book, I had a strangely emotional reaction. And I don't typically have an emotional reaction for reading books sort of in my field, right? I maybe have a cognitive reaction or something, but not emotional. I would describe. What this book did for me is I felt like it almost helped me define my identity as a researcher, almost as if I had been a researcher doing a bunch of sort of scattered research that didn't necessarily coalesce into a theme for me. I was out doing stuff that I thought was important, I thought was interesting and meaningful and so forth, but I never thought of it as being sort of a cohesive package that's contributing to some larger social mission until I read this damn book. This book is really interesting. Haugen heads the International Justice Mission, which does a lot of justice reform projects around the world. The work that he and his group are most known for is doing these investigations and even raids on human trafficking issues in Thailand, in India, in Cambodia, in the Philippines. I was kind of excited because there was a little page in this book where he talked about some work that Chuck and I did on human trafficking in the Philippines. So I have a slight bias toward the book for that reason. But what I appreciate about this book is what Haugen says, and actually it's summarized here. The reason he calls it the locust effect is he says violence is, and I think, Ann, you said you have a meeting on locusts, right? We have a connection here.
I'm speaking there at 12:30.
And so what he talks about is locusts sort of sweeping through and destroying everything in their path. And what he talks about is basically that the development world is largely organized around eradicating poverty, but that historically it has not done a good job. And it's certainly changing in recent years, due to the efforts of many of you in the room, I might add. But that historically the development community has, as somebody, she's somebody who's been doing sort of a lifetime of development work. I'm somebody who's been doing a lifetime of criminology work. Now she's starting to wander into criminology. I'm starting to wander in development. And what she's saying is, I don't know criminology. And I'm saying, I don't know development. And what we're seeing now is this